So thank you very much for the invitation to do this. It's always very nice to come to this day. And the question we were posed, Nick and I, in the invitation was, is there really anything new? And whether that question applies to GIS education or to GIS as a whole, I think we can play with both. I thought I would make 4 points. 4 ways in which I think GIS education has issues, is challenged at this point, 4 things which we really need to resolve in some way. So the first of these comes from outside, and it's the general enthusiasm for big data, which I like to capitalize because it's more than just data being big. Data science, analytics, the 4th paradigm, all of these I kind of lump together as a major influence coming from outside this field. And so the question is, how should we respond, if at all? And let me present it this way, that I think that many of the things that are talked about in the big data field, in data science, et cetera, are topics with which we are actually very familiar. They're topics such as metadata. We had a metadata standard in 1992. This has been around for a long time. We know about metadata. Questions of uncertainty. There's a large literature on uncertainty in this field. Provenance, data sharing, archiving, all of these things are things that we've been talking about in this community for a long time. So in that sense, I think that we are well prepared, if you like, for the world of big data. I think GIS students are well prepared for it. And I suggest that we, therefore, take in hand a task, which is to do a global replace of the word analysis with analytics in all of our CVs and all of our resumes, to do a global replace of geographic information science with geographic data science, simply to reflect the fact that I think we are, in many ways, better qualified for the growing world of big data than others. I've spent a long time thinking about whether one can attack data science as generic. In other words, are there things about data which apply irrespective of the context and irrespective of the domain? Or do we have to look domain by domain? And I would argue very strongly for the latter. I think that the problems of geographic data science are very distinctive and require something which is a real dedication, which you would not get if you had simply data science without qualification. Right? So I'm very much specific rather than generic in that sense. I think that there are 2 caveats which I'd raise on this point. Right? The first one is you often read the phrase, let the data speak for themselves. This is the basis of the 4th paradigm. This is the notion that theory is dead. It's all now about data. We should be able to make new discoveries simply from data, without any theoretical basis. And without wanting to go into that in any great detail, let me say that data is not geography. Our representations in GIS are never a perfect copy of the real world. And let's make sure that when we say something of that nature, we are saying, let the geography speak for itself, rather than let the data speak for themselves. There's a very important issue there, which is it is impossible to create a perfect replica of the planet. It's impossible to measure location perfectly. We know very well that everything we do in GIS has uncertainty associated with it. So in letting the data speak for themselves, we're not studying the world. We're studying the data. And that's a very important distinction. And it's a distinction which cannot exist in there. It can only exist up here. Only I know the difference between my database and reality. My computer doesn't. So what my computer tells me is something about the data, not about the geography. And that, I think, is a very important point which I would really want to emphasize in any discussion of big data. The second caveat is that all of the success stories about big data are stories about prediction. They're stories about how it was possible to predict the stock market, or the winner of the Eurovision Song Contest, or the spread of flu in the United States, right? Those are the classic stories. How does that relate to GIS? Well, I think it relates in the following way. You need to think about prediction not as a question of when, but a question of where. And prediction of where Where is something going to occur? What is going to happen here is what we are all about. So in trying to learn lessons from big data, I suggest we think about spatial prediction rather than temporal prediction. And that, to my mind, opens up a whole domain which has never been very prominent in GIS. There have been examples. There are studies in GIS which have used techniques for prediction, spatial prediction, but they've never been very widely used, and they're never very central to what we do. And my suggestion is we make it more central. Right? And that's my thought about how we adapt to the world of big data. That's the first point. The second point concerns programming. And this is the question which many GIS educators get of whether students should code. And there are many people who are passionate on one side of the equation, many people passionate on the other side. The way I like to look at it is in the following way. Many of the students that I encounter in GIS don't want to code. The reason they're doing this is so they don't have to code. So we are divided, right? One of the great joys of being in geography is that we got students, a mix of students, some of whom are technically able and some of whom are not. And some of whom will welcome the opportunity to code and some will not. And so to my mind, coding, at least insofar as I've been involved in GIS education, always has to be an option. If I have it as a requirement, I'm going to lose half the students, at least half the students. And that, to me, says something about the relationship between GIS, if you like, and computer science. I've been thinking about this quite a lot recently. I've been thinking about how to deal with a computer scientist who says, what's the big deal about geospatial technology? All it is a couple of coordinates in every record. What's the big deal, right? And so I have to have a quick elevator speech to respond to that, right? And one of the things I've been thinking about recently, I wrote a piece in Arc News about this, is what we should call our field. Now, it's dangerous to do that around Esri, because Esri is totally committed to GIS. But there are many people in this field who don't even recognize that acronym, let alone know how to decode it. People who come through computer science, for example, who've studied spatial databases, spatial algorithms, and all of a sudden there's this thing called GIS. What's that? So I think there's a real question about what we should call our field on the grounds that we are not currently capturing all of it if we use the acronym GIS. So I wrote this piece, and I had to modify it considerably because it was going into Arc News. But out of it came a few suggestions. And one of the suggestions was, yeah, this is a great idea. What we should call this field is spatial informatics. And I wrote back and said, I take a very, very different view, because if you call it spatial informatics, you're making informatics prime and the spatial the qualification. And to me, what should be prime is geography. This is a way of doing geography to me. So I would much prefer, for example, digital geography rather than spatial informatics as a way of capturing the field. But this is, I think, an issue which we in the GIS ed business, as they say, need to think about and probably need to reach some resolution of. That's the second point. The third point is kind of a familiar one, but this is the point about education versus training. Are we in the business of educating, or are we in the business of training? And coming from the University of California, I have a particular perspective on this, because in the UC system, there is no offering of surveying. The UC system takes a very distinctive position, which is that surveying does not belong in the University of California. Right? So every now and then I've had to defend GIS, making arguments that it's not like surveying and therefore belongs in the University of California. It's an intellectual field rather than a set of procedures or vocation or whatever. So I think a lot about the relationship between education and training. And I think education is about principles. It's about things which will be true 20 years from now. And so that's how I've always wanted to structure my courses. Not about today's version of the technology, because that'll be gone tomorrow. What I want to educate people in is the principles of GIS, the principles of geographic information science, if you like, things like Tobler's first law of geography. These are things which will always be true. So this came home to me very, very, very strongly in March of 2005, because that was the month when Google released Google Earth. And for years, I had been teaching a full year course in GIS. The students struggled mightily. This going back to the days when it was all command line interfaces, and you had to get the syntax right. It was hell, right? And at the end of the third quarter, I needed to give them something in the way of a prize, some reward, something nice. And so what I used to give them was an exercise in using ArcScene to generate a flyby, right? And they loved it. They flew over Santa Barbara, they took a video, they showed it to their parents, they showed it to their partners, and wow, this was great. March of 2005, Google Earth came out. A child of 10 could do that in 10 minutes. Right? What was I about? Yeah? What was I doing? Making a big deal of something that a child of 10 could do in 10 minutes. And that's, of course, that situation, of course, is getting worse now because we have things like ArcGIS Online, which is making it possible with a very simple interface for someone the equivalent of a child of 10 to do something in 10 minutes. So I think really there are two models here that we need to be conscious of. There's what I call the child of 10 model, making the interface sufficiently simple that a child of 10 can do something in 10 minutes, compared to the concert pianist model, if you like, the GIS professional, who has endured years of higher education in order to become good at this and really values what they've learned. Right? So that's a really sharp contrast. Or if, putting it another way, in a world of Google Earth or ArcGIS Online, what does everybody need to know? And that, I think, is a very strong guiding principle for us. It comes back again to the principles. You know, in 20 years, it will still be true that the Earth is not flat. So let's not teach a technology which requires the Earth to be flat. There are all sorts of ramifications of this. Okay. So the fourth point, and this really comes out of that thinking about Google Earth, et cetera, and that is that what this is really about is what I would call spatial thinking. And I will hold very strongly that thinking spatially is different, that we almost never get an opportunity to learn to think spatially, and that this is really what I have been able to do over the last 45 years. I think differently. Okay, so let's try a few examples. Let me assert, according to the Congressional Research Office, the state of North Carolina has 301 miles of coastline. Who is cringing? Right, okay. According to the state of Minnesota, Minnesota has 10,000 lakes. Who is cringing? I'm cringing, right? Who discovered that? You know, what poor student spent a summer poring over maps, counting lakes, and realized after about an hour on the job that there was no formal definition of a lake. It was impossible to count lakes because you couldn't decide what was a lake and what wasn't a lake. Right? Or third one, the Burning Man Festival, and this is according to their website, is held in the second flattest region in the United States. Does that make you cringe? It certainly makes me cringe. Right? And it recalls that wonderful paper on the question of whether Kansas is truly as flat as a pancake, which was done beautifully. Right? So what I'm saying is that GIS education introduces a different way of thinking. It's one of the reasons why it takes so long, why the learning curve is so long, because you have to change the way people think. You have to reorient thinking from the way humans do it, which is involving place names, to the way computers do it, which is involving coordinates. And that's not simple. And you have to deal with the fact that the Earth isn't flat, and so on and so forth. So I like to think, and the first lecture I give is on what I would call critical spatial thinking. And critical spatial thinking I would define as what goes on in the mind of a GIS professional when doing GIS, right? Which is distinctly not what goes on in there, it's what goes on in here. And that, to me, is a crucial aspect. And in all of those three examples, critical spatial thinking makes you cringe. So it's what goes on in the mind while using a GIS. And compare that to the question, what goes on in the mind when using a hammer? And without wishing in any way to disparage people in the construction industry, I'd suggest that it's not the same kind of thing at all. If GIS is merely using a tool, it's doing something much more up here than a lot of other tools do. So I would like to define GIS as a way of augmenting reality, not replacing it. I think too often we think of our GIS as giving us a copy of the world which we can play with, and of course it never does. What it does, perhaps, is augment what goes on up here. And that's what I want to focus on in GIS education. So those are my 4 comments, and thanks for your attention.